Hi, everybody. This is lecture 17, Democracies and the Great Depression. Okay? And what I want to do is I want to talk about the democracies, the Great Depression, and fascism. Then I want to talk about the pushback against racial hierarchy, racism, then the causes for World War II in this lecture. Okay? So let's get started. Um, Before starting this lesson, I definitely want you to review the Great Depression. What was the spark? Do you remember Black Tuesday? And why did the Great Depression happen? Black Tuesday was a spark and perhaps a cause, but it wasn't the only cause. Okay? You have other causes. Remember the diagrams of the way money was revolving as the US lent money to Germany. Germany used some of that money to pay reparations. And then Europeans were supposed to buy US goods to continue the circle. But with this spark, Black Tuesday, what ends up happening? Okay? And what ends up happening to the most industrialized countries in the world. All right? So keep that in mind. And so we are in the Great Depression. And I want us to look, your book takes a look at France. So I want to examine the U.S. response to the Great Depression. The U.S. is a democracy. And I also want to examine a little bit Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and their responses, okay? Because they do not turn to fascism, they turn to something called populism. And I want to talk about that because it ties in with what we've been discussing about mass media, about the connection between politicians and mass media. All right, so we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He becomes elected president of the U.S. 1932. And what I want you guys to do is select either this or both. And you're going to get two accounts. The first is left-leaning, NPR News. The second is right-leaning from a YouTuber. Okay? And they're both going to talk about what's known as the Wall Street Putsch. This is a conspiracy by right-leaning individuals, many of them captains of industry, and also some politicians, as they formulate a plan to overthrow the government, overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president, force him to basically become a puppet president as they install somebody else, and they place their confidence in Smedley Butler, who was very respected by soldiers at that time. He is a former Marine. He held he won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, and they trusted him. However, he's very critical of his service, and he characterizes himself as an enforcer for capitalism, an enforcer of capitalism. And he ends up going to Congress with this plan. And that's what's detailed in both of these, okay? Here and here. I would encourage you to listen to both so you can see, again, a left-leaning and a right-leaning account of what happened. All right? So again, this big push, and again, it ties into what happened in Germany, okay? In Germany, we have the rise of the Nazi Party, okay? With Hitler becoming chancellor, all right? So in the U.S., these pressures of the Great Depression did lead some people to think that what Roosevelt was proposing was wrong, was communist, okay? And it does lead these people to, again, to form an alliance and to make plans to basically overthrow Roosevelt and install an autocratic regime. All right? So take a look at that. Now, some of that response by Roosevelt and Congress in the U.S. was government spending. Okay? So it's going to lead to what's known as the welfare state. Here's a definition of the welfare state. a system of government that provides programs for the well-being of most of its citizens by promoting programs such as pensions, disability insurance, and national health care. Many governments develop these programs as responses to the Great Depression. Okay, in Nazi Germany, you have some of these programs as well. Okay, again, so this is government interference. By my definition, these are socialist programs. Okay, remember my definition? You have capitalism on one end, socialism on one end, and again, this is an introductory class. So with this definition, we have capitalism is that the market redistributes wealth in a capitalist system, completely capitalist, which doesn't exist. In a socialist system, the government redistributes wealth through taxes, tariffs, and so on. So most governments are somewhere in the middle. Some are closer to capitalism, to pure capitalism, which again does not exist. Some are closer to pure socialism, which again does not exist. So that was my definition in this introductory class. So keep that in mind. Many of the rules, many of the decisions made to create this welfare state are socialist decisions, which lead to the government redistributing money, okay, in a large way. All right. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt began the welfare state in the U.S. with his actions. The New Deal from 1933 to 38, and these are some of the parts of the New Deal. It focused on infrastructure spending. It created Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay, so this is an insurance on deposits to banks. Remember, one of the major causes of the Great Depression was the run on banks because people lost trust in banks and they wanted their money. But banks have this money invested in different ventures, so they couldn't pull the money to give back to the people. So many banks started crashing as people lost their faith in the banks and they started crashing. And so this FDIC insurance, it guarantees, like a decade or two ago was like 100,000. Now it's more. I can't remember exactly how much, but the government guarantees it might be up to 200,000, up to $200,000 in savings at a bank, so that people have faith in banks and don't try to do their thing. Don't repeat what happened during the Great Depression. Okay? Social Security. All of us who work, we contribute to Social Security, and the theory is that when you're older, Social Security, and you cannot work anymore, that'll be part of your retirement, or that'll be your retirement. Okay? So you can live on more or less comfortably during retired life. All right. You also have the Work Progress Administration. Okay, that it's gonna employ large numbers of people who are unemployed in different infrastructure projects. One example was I went to Lincoln Elementary in Pomona, and Lincoln Elementary in Pomona was built during the Great Depression as part of the Work Progress Administration. Okay, so they don't pass comprehensive health care. Businesses provide health care in the U.S. Okay, so but they do pass these programs, again, Social Security, unemployment insurance. Okay, when people get fired, they can go to unemployment and get money, redistributed money, until they can find another job. Now, because we do have a racial hierarchy, these funds discriminate because we have a racial hierarchy, we have racism. African Americans don't have the same access that people of European descent have. They just don't. It's been proven again and again by historians. Okay, practices such as redlining. Okay, practices such as access to services like unemployment is much more limited for minorities such as African Americans. Okay, during this time period also, again, Mexican Americans don't have the same access, and many are even deported to Mexico during this time, even though they are citizens. Okay, so this idea of racism, racial hierarchy, white supremacy, it's definitely going strong in the 1930s during the Depression. Okay? So think of the welfare state. Now in Latin America, we have something called populism. Okay? They're not as affected by the Great Depression as Western Europe, the US, but they are still affected, and the approach is they're semi-industrialized. They have some small industries like bottling companies, beer bottling companies, for example. They make smaller products in factories like soap. Okay, they have a certain number of railroads, not to the same degree as the U.S. and Western Europe, but they do have railroads. They do have some. They do have infrastructure. So you can consider countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile to be like at a middle level of industrialization when compared to Western Europe, like your Germany, France, England, and the U.S. Okay. Now there, the approach is also to use mass media. Politicians use mass media, and they become populists. Juan and Eva Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas, Lázaro Cárdenas. Okay, so it's populism is this political approach in which politicians utilize mass media to create a persona that appeals to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established political and economic elites. Okay, to my way of seeing things, I think fascism is a type of populism. Okay, it's a type of populism because politicians do use this, but it's much more. Fascism is much more, in my opinion, nationalistic and racial than the populism in Latin America. Okay, and I'll explain why in the next section of this lecture. All right. So again, the results of these populists in Argentina, Juan and Eva Perón. This is them speaking. There's Juan Perón speaking before a crowd. And again, just like politicians in Europe, they're using microphones. They're using these mass rallies. Microphone amplifies the voice, so this mass rally can hear their speaker. They're using rhetoric that appeals. These are more class-based approaches rather than racial-based approaches. Okay, they're more class-based approaches. Juan and Eva Perón appeal to the descamisados, the shirtless. Okay, so there's less of a racial input in Latin American populism than in the fascism of Germany or Italy. Okay, so Getulio Vargas in Brazil. Oh, and Juan and Eva Perón. They will create a political party that remains viable in Argentina today. Lázaro Cárdenas will be a populist. He'll make needed changes. Again, he's going to appeal more to class rather than race. Okay? So Mexico is racially mixed society. He does enact, what do you call it, land redistribution to indigenous communities. And again, his appeal is more class-based than racially based, like Hitler. Hitler definitely this concept of race. For them, this idea of class. For example, Lázaro Cárdenas will nationalize the different gasoline factories in Mexico and make it part of the country. He'll nationalize that. Okay. So you'll see some of these responses. They do tend to be different. He's also seen as the beginning of the PRI party, this political party that'll hold power in Mexico for, I think, around 50 years. Okay? So he's seen as the beginning of the PRI party. And these individuals are all very popular in their countries, okay? Especially among the working class, because their appeals tend to be more based on class rather than race. Now, I want to talk about pushback against racial hierarchy, against racism. I want to first focus on individuals. I want to first focus on individuals and then groups of people. So it's the other way around. Let's go this way. Okay, and then groups of people. Now some individuals that are pushing back. One of these is Franz Boas. He He is a scholar of Jewish descent who flees Germany, goes to the U.S., and he's a renowned scholar, and he studies indigenous peoples. And as he's developing indigenous studies in the U.S., he starts pushing his students to learn indigenous languages because he claims that he compares indigenous studies to the classics, the studies of Greece and Rome. And he's like, people in the classics, scholars of the classics, would laugh at us, meaning people who study indigenous peoples, if we study indigenous peoples without understanding their languages. And so this is a pushback, this is a support, again, against racial hierarchy, because in valuing indigenous studies at the same level as the classics, again, he's raising the study of indigenous peoples. Again, it's not there yet. It's the beginning. It's not civil rights, but again, it is a beginning. Okay, it is a type of pushback against the accepted racial hierarchies at the time. Okay, and you're going to have a series of scholars again that are either taught by him or inspired by him, such as Benjamin Lee Whorf, who will start to like write and push back against racism. Benjamin Lee Whorf, he was an insurance adjuster, but he switched careers, became a scholar, and he wrote a paper where he said that Navajo was more scientific than English. And he looked at different grammatical structures of Navajo to propose that it was more scientific as a way of showing that again, push back against the racial hierarchy, showing that indigenous people are as worthy as Europeans. Okay, they're equal to Europeans. They have the same hardware. They're human beings. So that's the purpose of that paper, to push back against the rhetoric found in Nazi Germany, the rhetoric found again in fascist Italy, and other places, and in the U.S. as well. Rhetoric which demeaned people of color. All right. In Brazil, as I mentioned earlier, during the colonial period, the majority of the population was of African descent. Again, the majority of the population was of African descent during the colonial period for Brazil, which is roughly 1500 until, I believe, 1822 when it becomes independent. That's when the colonial period ends. And later on, the North has a much larger Afro descent population than the South. Okay, in Brazil, one scholar compared to the South tends to be more even in distribution between people of European descent and African descent. Okay, and what he starts proposing is this idea of racial democracy, and he's using democracy to mean brotherhood, racial brotherhood. And in a work, The Masters and the Slaves, he proposes that the inheritance of Brazil is equally African, European, and indigenous, which again, for the time, the first half of the 1900s, is radical for the time. Okay, so he starts, again, he's another person that's pushing back against the racism that was prevalent at the time. All right. Then we have President Getulio Vargas. During his second presidency, he's going to start promoting racial democracies in the policies that his administration promotes. Again, this idea that the inheritance of Brazil is not just European, but equally European, African, indigenous. Okay, so again, radical for the time. Okay, you can read more about Getulio Vargas here on this link. You also have Vasconcelos, who's a scholar and the Minister of Education shortly after the end of the Mexican Revolution. And he's going to promote that, similar to Getulio Vargas, this idea of mixing as being okay, as being a type of another race, a cosmic race. And he says that in contrast to the U.S., where it was segregated, Mexico was equally indigenous, African, European, and that was something to be proud of, okay? Because it was the future. It was a new race, a cosmic race. Sometimes you'll hear Mexicans say, "Viva la raza, long live the race." And that's a callback to this very influential essay, Long Live This Mixed Race. Okay? So again, this is a pushback. This is the reinforcing of this color brown, right? Both Brazil and Mexico, depending. And again, historically, if we look at Brazil, historically, if we look at Mexico, Brazil during the colonial period had a majority Afro descent population. Mexico during the colonial period had a majority indigenous descent population. Okay? So the government was led by Europeans, people of European descent, but again, the majority of the populations were people of color. And that influenced the development of these countries. And now, through these concepts of cosmic race, racial democracy, scholars within those countries are promoting a new view. The previous view was whitening, encouraging European immigration to Brazil and to Mexico to lighten the skin of the country. So this idea of racial democracy, cosmic race, replaces this old whitening trope. Okay, and it is a pushback against racism, this racial hierarchy. Okay, now groups. These are some groups that pushed back, that were anti-racist. So the Japanese delegation during the Treaty of Versailles, they won a clause guaranteeing racial equality within the League of Nations. But the clause was rejected. But again, they're pushing back. They're, in a sense, classifying themselves as people of color. And like I mentioned before, the industrialization of Japan was very important around the world because it did serve as inspiration for non-Europeans seeking to industrialize. It offered a model for non-Europeans about how to excluding the U.S. Non-Europeans and non-U.S. who were seen as white. The industrialization of Japan offered a model for political elites, economic elites in places like the Ottoman Empire, Brazil, Mexico. Let me see what else. Brazil, Mexico, places where they have non-European majorities. Okay, so also another group, African American porters. Okay, so Pullman, the Pullman Company, in the first half of the 1900s, the easiest way to travel cross country was on the trains. And for business travelers or people willing to spend more, they can spend time in a Pullman cart. In a Pullman cart, the people who bought a ticket for the Pullman cart, they would be treated first class. And the porters, the ones who were the representatives of the Pullman Company, who served the people traveling first class across the trains, were African American. Because Mr. Pullman, he saw that he could hire African Americans for a lower rate than white porters, and he also believed, due to slavery, that African American men were more likely to be better servants. Okay? Well, African American porters gained agency despite the humiliation that they suffered at times by being Pullman porters. They were, even though they were paid less than white porters would have been paid, their earnings were higher than most African American workers at that time. And by being on the trains, they learned about different parts of the U.S. and they could tell their families. And so, in a sense, they performed reconnaissance about places where life would be better for them and their families. And so they're one of the major reasons why you're going to have a great migration out of the South to different parts of the U.S. by by African Americans. Okay, because these porters, African American porters, tell their families, their loved ones, "Hey, look, this is a better place for us to live. We should go live over here." And families did move again out of the South during the first half of the during the first half of the 20th century. All right. Uh, so here. Okay. So those are a few examples of people of anti-racists. Okay. I'll talk more about the Pullman Porters later. They're very important because again, they have more they earn more money than most other African workers, and you're even going to have some Pullman Porters sponsoring a young preacher known as Martin Luther King, which I'll talk about in another lecture. So I'll talk more about the contribution of Pullman Porters. Now let's go back. So you saw the responses by the U.S. and democracies in Latin America to the Great Depression. Now what I want to talk about is are the causes for World War II. All right. So we've talked about the Versailles Treaty and how onerous, how heavy how heavy Germany, Austria, Hungary, how heavily the defeated countries were punished. So that's going to be part of the seeds, part of the causes for World War II. Okay, so the Germans are going to have heavy resentment for these November criminals. Remember, the Versailles Treaty was signed on November 11th. Well, actually, World War I, the Versailles Treaty, it's complicated, but the end of World War I was November 11th, 1918. What holiday do we celebrate around November 11th, November 10th? That's related to the end of World War I. Okay, so another reason you're going to have is the weakened Western economies. Okay, these weakened Western economies who need reparations. That's why they charge Germany, Austria with reparations. And this Versailles Treaty is definitely going to lead to enhanced Nazi appeal because the Nazis are going to call for Germany for the German people. We're a superior race. We were stabbed in the back. Look at what this cartoon has. A German soldier with his rifle pointed in this direction. And look at who's holding the knife. Look at the insignia on the hat of this lady. Okay? Look at the insignia. Who does that represent? Okay? So, again, the Nazis are going to promote this idea of we have enemies within the Roma, the Hebrews, Jewish people. Okay? This redrawing of the map of Europe is also caused a lot of resentment. Remember all the territory that was taken from Germany, from Austria, from Hungary. Okay, you're going to have resentment and resentful populations, which become minorities, such as Germans in Czechoslovakia. Okay, German populations in Czechoslovakia, and so on. All right, the League of Nations will fail. Remember, one of the main reasons why it fails is the U.S. never joins it. And the U.S. was the one that was least affected by World War I out of the Western powers. Okay. Then, of course, the Great Depression. We talked about that and how this economic desperation led many people to try to find a dictator, an autocratic ruler to put things in place, okay, to fix everything. And you're also going to have the resurgence of imperial ambitions connected to racial nationalism. Okay? So keep that in mind. And let's look at the redrawing of the let's review this. We've talked about this before in a previous lecture. Remember Austria and Hungary? Austria becomes, again, according to the treaty, they cannot join with Germany, even though Austria is a German-led nation state. But they cannot join with Germany. That was one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember how much territory Hungary lost Okay, Czechoslovakia also gained territory, right? Uh, but that territory does contain German minority. All right, Poland. Think about how they gained territory. Think about the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. All right. Look at some of the propaganda causes for the Great Depression. All right. That's a sickle. So, hammer and sickle. Who does the angel represent? Does it represent socialists, communists? And look at the angel. This angel with this sickle and hammer hat there is walking together with, who might this person represent? Again, stereotypes. Stereotype. Which minority in Germany is stereotyped as being wealthy? Okay? So think about the propaganda and how the propaganda is inflaming people against racial minorities. And again, the concept of race in Germany is different from the concept of race in the US. In Germany, Germans are seen as a superior race, brothers with the English, Germanic peoples. In Germany, the Roma and the Jewish people are seen as inferior races. The concept of race, racism is different depending on the region. Now, resurgence of imperial ambitions. Japan, here is Japan. Japan is very resource poor regarding resources required for industrialization. They don't have gasoline deposits. They have to acquire gasoline elsewhere. Okay? Same thing with coal deposits. They're resource poor with these resources necessary for industrialization. The climate is not good for growing rubber trees and rubber. Okay? So what they're going to do is democratic governments of Japan and the army, actually. The army will begin conquering different parts of more resource-rich areas, like Manchuria. Okay. So Japan, whoops. So like Japan, they're going to conquer Manchuria, a very resource-rich area. There's also going to be what's known as in Manchuria. Japan, the Japanese army will institute sexual slavery for their soldiers serving in Manchuria, and they're gonna take women from Korea, from China, and use them as sexual slaves for their troops. In 1935, Italy will invade Ethiopia to recapture Roman glory and to avenge a previous defeat at the hands of the Ethiopian army in the late 1800s. Okay. Meanwhile, Germany, and that will be the next map, right here. So Germany's going to withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933. They're going to remilitarize the Rhineland, which they were not supposed to do, according to the treaty. So Rhineland is right here. They're going to remilitarize it. Okay. And they're remilitarizing when Hitler comes to power and promotes this racial nationalism. They're going to find different ways to remilitarize. For example, they're going to use the national airline to train pilots, okay, as a way of training military pilots. They'll use the national airline, the national civilian airline, to train military pilots as a way of getting around the stipulations of the treaty that they couldn't have more than 100,000 men in their army. Okay? And they're also going to remilitarize the Rhineland. Okay? In 1938, 1937, we have two German nation states, Austria and Germany, next to each other. Well, in 1938, with the Anschluss, Germany will absorb Austria. Okay? So Germany will expand into Austria because you're going to have a Nazi party undermining Austrian democracy. Okay? And with the Anschluss, both of these regions will be united under the nation state of Germany. All right? Now, at the Munich conference, German diplomats will demand the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is a very industrialized region of Czechoslovakia, which does have a German population, which Germany will use as an excuse. Again, Germany for the Germans. Okay? So they'll demand the Sudetenland for themselves, for Germany. Okay? And what's going to happen is other European powers will acquiesce. They'll accept that Germany has a right to the they'll accept that Germany has a right to the Sudetenland. Okay? So militarization of the Rhineland, absorption of the Sudetenland, which again had been a part of Czechoslovakia. Okay? And then Germany will occupy Western Czechoslovakia. All right? So you see how Germany's Hitler, the Nazi party, are seeing how much they can get away with, because people still remember World War I and how devastating it was. They don't want another war. Okay? So this is the path to World War II. All right? And with this, I'm going to stop. Okay? In the next lecture, I'll tell you about Poland. Okay? And how Hitler will order the invasion of Poland, which is the spark that starts World War II. All right? Thank you very much. In this lecture, we talked about democracies, the Great Depression, and fascism, pushback against racial hierarchy, and the causes for World War II.